They said I was out of compliance, that my ranch, my land, my silence was a threat to their order. So they sent security, not to protect, but to remind. To remind me that power doesn't knock, it enters. That control doesn't ask, it enforces. But what happens when a system designed to dominate meets a boundary it can't cross? What happens when the illusion of authority collides with the reality of resistance? They came with rules. They left with consequences. And I'm left asking, when the enforcers break, what does that say about the system that sent them? They say isolation is dangerous, not because it breeds chaos, but because it resists control. My Lakefront Ranch was never meant to be a fortress. It was meant to be a sanctuary, a place where silence wasn't suspicious, where autonomy wasn't defiance, where the land spoke louder than policy. But systems don't like silence. They don't like ambiguity. They don't like places that exist outside their choreography. And so the letters began. Notices, warnings, violations. The language was sterile, but the message was clear. You are not outside. You are not exempt. You are not free. I ignored them at first, not out of arrogance, out of principle, because when a system demands obedience without dialogue, resistance becomes a form of truth. I watch the lake every morning, its surface unbothered by bureaucracy, its rhythm untouched by regulation. And I wondered, what does it mean to live outside the grid? To exist without being measured? To own without being owned? The HOA didn't see my ranch as land. They saw it as territory, as deviation, as threat, and threats must be neutralized. That's how systems survive, not by adapting, but by enforcing. I thought about Thoreau, about civil disobedience, about the idea that the most sacred space is the one untouched by institutional hands. And I knew, deep down, that the letters were just a beginning, that the system doesn't retreat. It escalates. Then came the visit, not a neighbor, not a conversation. Security, uniformed, branded, authorized. They didn't knock. They announced, we're here to inspect. Inspect what? My compliance? My submission? My silence? I stood at the threshold, the line between autonomy and intrusion, and I felt it, that shift, that moment when solitude becomes rebellion, when privacy becomes provocation, when presence becomes resistance. I didn't invite them in. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I simply stood, and in that stillness, I saw their discomfort, because systems are trained to respond to movement, to negotiation, to panic, to fear. But stillness? Stillness is unreadable. Stillness is dangerous. They walked the perimeter, took notes, whispered, and I watched, not with anger, with clarity, because clarity is what remains when illusion dies. I saw them not as individuals, but as extensions, as instruments, as symbols of a system that cannot tolerate ambiguity. And I wondered, what happens when symbols fail? When authority meets a boundary it cannot cross? When the enforcers realize they are not welcome, not feared, not obeyed? I didn't raise my voice. I didn't raise my hand. I raised my presence. And presence, I've learned, is the most powerful form of resistance. They left that day with questions, not about me, about themselves, about the system, about the threshold they couldn't breach. Silence unsettles systems. It doesn't fit the script. It doesn't offer cues. It doesn't negotiate. After the first visit, after the perimeter was walked and the clipboard was filled, I returned to my solitude, not as retreat, as statement. I didn't respond to their notes. I didn't acknowledge their warnings. I didn't engage their language, because engagement is a form of submission, and silence, when chosen, is a form of power. But power, when unrecognized, becomes threat, and threat, in the eyes of authority, must be neutralized. So they escalated, not with conversation, with presence, with force, with bodies. It wasn't just one this time. It was three, uniformed, armed, not with weapons, with posture, with entitlement, with the kind of confidence that comes from institutional backing. They didn't ask. They declared, we're here to enforce compliance. Compliance with what? With a code? With a culture? With a choreography I never agreed to? I stood again at the threshold, and again I didn't move, because movement is what they expect. Movement is what they're trained to control. But stillness? Stillness is unreadable. Stillness is dangerous. They stepped forward. I didn't flinch. And in that moment, I saw it, the crack, the hesitation, the realization that authority, when unacknowledged, becomes uncertain. They began to search, not with permission, with assumption. They opened gates, peered through windows, circled the barn, and I followed, not with confrontation, with presence. I didn't shout. I didn't threaten. I didn't plead. I simply existed. And existence, when unyielding, becomes resistance. One of them turned to me, said, "You're making this harder than it needs to be." And I thought, harder for whom? For the system that expects obedience? For the enforcers who expect fear? For the narrative that expects collapse? Because silence, when misunderstood, becomes mirror. It reflects the system back to itself. And what it sees is not strength. It sees fragility. They tried to document, to photograph, to record, but the lens doesn't capture defiance. It captures surfaces. And surfaces, when stripped of context, become propaganda. I stood in every frame, unmoving, unapologetic, and they grew restless. Because restlessness is what happens when control fails. One of them raised his voice. Another stepped too close. And the third, the youngest, hesitated. That hesitation was the fracture. The moment the choreography broke. The moment the illusion faltered. Because systems don't collapse from confrontation. They collapse from doubt, from the realization that the script no longer works. I didn't touch them. I didn't threaten them. But something broke. Not in me, in them, in the posture, in the entitlement, in the confidence. They left not with victory, but with questions, with silence, with the weight of a presence they couldn't decode. And I was left with clarity. That silence is not weakness. That solitude is not surrender. That resistance doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply refuses. And refusal, when sustained, becomes revolution, not of violence, of truth, of presence, of being. And maybe that's what broke them, not their bodies, their certainty. Systems are built on belief, not just in their rules, but in their inevitability. The HOA didn't send security because I was dangerous. They sent them because I was unreadable, because ambiguity is the one thing systems cannot tolerate. They thrive on clarity, on categories, on compliance, on control. But when those fail, when the expected response doesn't arrive, the system begins a fracture, not visibly, not immediately, but philosophically. And that fracture is more dangerous than any act of defiance, because it forces the system to confront its own mythology, the story it tells itself about its power, its reach, its righteousness. After the second visit, the silence returned. Not mine, theirs. No more letters. No more warnings. Just absence. And absence, I've learned, is not retreat. It's recalibration. They were rethinking, reframing, trying to understand why the script didn't work, why the choreography collapsed, why the enforcers left not with compliance, but with questions. I imagine the meetings, the language, non-compliant resident, uncooperative behavior, potential liability. But liability in this case wasn't legal. It was ideological. Because when one person refuses a script, the entire performance begins to wobble. I walk the perimeter of my ranch every morning, not out of paranoia, out of ritual, out of presence. And I notice things. A car parked longer than usual, a drone hovering briefly, a neighbor watching from behind a curtain. And I understood the system hadn't retreated. It had shifted from over-enforcement to quiet observation, from confrontation to containment. Because when force fails, surveillance steps in. It's quieter, more palatable, easier to justify, but no less invasive. And I felt it, that shift, that recalibration, that attempt to reassert control without appearing aggressive. But control, once broken, is hard to reassemble, because the fracture isn't just external, it's internal. It's epistemological. It's the moment the system begins to doubt its own story. I saw it in the way the HOA communications changed. Less declarative, more cautious, more vague. I saw it in the way neighbors spoke, not with certainty, but with curiosity. What happened? Did they really send security? Why you? And I realized the fracture was spreading, not as rebellion, as awareness, as a slow, unsettling realization that the system might not be as stable as it claims. I thought about Nietzsche, about the abyss that stares back, about how systems, when confronted with resistance, begin to see themselves, not as omnipotent, as fragile, as constructed, and construction, once exposed, invites deconstruction. I didn't need to fight. I didn't need to shout. I just needed to remain, to exist, to reflect. And reflection, when sustained, becomes confrontation, not of violence, of truth, of presence, of being. And that's what systems fear most, not collapse, but exposure. Because exposure reveals the scaffolding, the assumptions, the illusions. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if they'd escalate again. But I knew this. The fracture had begun. And fractures, once formed, don't heal easily. They spread. They deepen. They invite questions. And questions, once asked, refuse to be silenced. I wasn't trying to dismantle the system. I was trying to live. But sometimes, living outside the choreography is the most radical act of all. I didn't set out to be a symbol. I didn't want to be a mirror. But when systems fail to decode you, they begin to fear you. And fear, when institutionalized, becomes projection. They didn't know what to do with me. The resident who didn't comply, didn't engage, didn't collapse. So they began to project, not just suspicion. Mythology. Rumors spread. He's hostile. He's unstable. He's dangerous. But danger, I've learned, is often just a name for what the system can't control. And control, once disrupted, seeks narrative. It needs a story to explain the fracture. And I had become that story. Neighbors began to distance themselves. Not out of malice, out of confusion, out of fear, out of the quiet pressure to conform. I saw it in their eyes, in the way they avoided conversation, in the way they looked at my ranch like it was radioactive. And I understood I had become a mirror, not of violence, of possibility, of refusal, of autonomy. And autonomy, when sustained, becomes contagious. That's what systems fear most, not rebellion, but replication. The idea that someone else might say no, might stand still, might refuse the choreography. I thought about Camus, about the absurd hero, about the man who pushes the boulder not because he expects victory, but because he refuses surrender. And I felt it, that absurdity, that clarity, that quiet defiance. I didn't need to win. I just needed to remain. And remaining, in a system built on movement, is radical. They sent another letter, this one different, softer. We'd like to resolve this amicably. Amicably? After surveillance? After intrusion? After projection? I didn't respond. Not out of spite, out of principle. Because when a system begins to negotiate, it's not offering peace. It's seeking restoration. Restoration of control. Restoration of narrative. I became more visible. Not through noise, through presence, through ritual, through rhythm. I walked the land. I tended the soil. I lived. And living, when unyielding becomes resistance. I saw the HOA car pass slowly. I saw the security team drive by, but not stop. I saw the neighbors watching, but not speaking. And I realized the mirror was working. It was reflecting not just fear, but possibility. The possibility that the system was not inevitable, that the choreography could be broken, that the silence could be chosen, not imposed. I didn't need allies. I didn't need applause. I needed truth. And truth, once embodied, becomes undeniable. I was no longer just a resident. I was a question, a disruption, a mirror. And mirrors, once placed, cannot be unseen. They force reflection. They force reckoning. They force systems to confront their own fragility. And maybe that's why they left broken. Not because I shattered their shins, but because I shattered their certainty, their narrative, their illusion. And once illusion breaks, what remains is truth. Raw, uncomfortable, liberating. Systems don't admit defeat. They dissolve into silence. After the mirror was placed, after the reflection became unavoidable, the HOA didn't escalate. They disappeared. No more visits. No more letters. No more surveillance. Just absence. But absence, I've learned, isn't peace. It's containment. It's the system folding in on itself, retreating behind its own walls, hoping the disruption will fade. I walked my land every morning, and the quiet felt different. Not serene. Suspicious. Like a stage after the actors have fled. Like a battlefield after the retreat. The choreography had collapsed, but the tension remained. Neighbors stopped speaking altogether. Not out of hostility, out of fear. Fear of being seen. Fear of being associated. Fear of being next. And I understood the system hadn't just retreated. It had infected the community. It had turned connection into caution, solidarity into silence. I became a ghost, visible but untouchable, present but avoided. And that's how systems survive collapse, by isolating the anomaly, by making the truth feel like exile. I didn't resist this. I embraced it, because exile when chosen becomes sanctuary, and sanctuary when protected becomes power. I thought about Derrida, about the trace, about how meaning lingers even after the structure dissolves. And I saw it everywhere, in the way the HOA stopped issuing fines, in the way the bylaws were quietly revised, in the way the security team was replaced with community liaisons. The language softened, but the architecture remained. The system hadn't changed, it had rebranded. Because collapse, when unacknowledged, becomes camouflage. And camouflage is just another form of control. I watched it happen. I documented it. I named it, not to fight it, to expose it. Exposure, I've learned, is more powerful than resistance. It doesn't demand action. It demands reckoning. And reckoning, once begun, cannot be undone. I became the story they tried to forget, the fracture they tried to seal, the mirror they tried to shatter. But mirrors, once placed, reflect endlessly. I didn't need to speak anymore. My presence was enough. My silence was loud. My refusal was permanent. And permanence, in a system built on performance, is revolutionary. I didn't win. There was no victory, no apology, no justice. But there was collapse. Quiet, unspoken, undeniable. The HOA still exists. The bylaws still circulate. The meetings still happen. But something is different. The confidence is gone. The certainty is fractured. The choreography is broken. And I remain, not as a rebel, as a reminder, that systems, no matter how polished, are fragile. That control, no matter how enforced, is temporary. That truth, no matter how buried, will rise. Truth doesn't arrive with fanfare. It doesn't announce itself. It lingers. It waits. It survives the collapse of illusion. After the system retreated, after the silence settled, after the choreography dissolved, I was left with something unexpected: stillness. Not the stillness of fear, the stillness of clarity. The kind that comes after storm, when the debris is visible, when the architecture is exposed, when the story can no longer be rewritten. I walk my land differently, not as a battleground, as a testament to what endured, to what refused, to what remained. And what remained was not victory. It was truth. The truth that systems are not omnipotent. That authority is not absolute. That control is not inevitable. That presence, when rooted in principle, can outlast performance. I thought about the first knock, the first clipboard, the first uniform, and I saw it now for what it was: not enforcement, but theater, a performance of power, a ritual of dominance. And I had disrupted it not with violence, but with refusal, with stillness, with being. And being, when unyielding, becomes truth. I didn't need to explain. I didn't need to justify. I didn't need to win. I just needed to remain. The HOA still exists. The bylaws still circulate. The meetings still happen. But something has shifted, not in them, in the air, in the silence, in the way people look at the system now, not with reverence, but with recognition. Recognition that it can be questioned, that it can be resisted, that it can be broken, and that breaking doesn't always look like chaos. Sometimes it looks like a man standing still on his own land. I became a story, a warning, a possibility. And possibility, once seen, cannot be unseen. I thought about the lake, about how it never changed, how it reflected everything, the sky, the trees, the silence. And I realized I had become the lake, still, reflective, unmoved. And in that reflection, the system saw itself, not as protector, as intruder, not as order, as fear, not as truth, as illusion. And illusions, once shattered, do not return. They haunt, they linger, they remind. I didn't need justice. I didn't need revenge. I needed truth. And truth, once found, becomes its own form of power, quiet, enduring, unbreakable.